Chapter 9. Olav had spared nothing in making his daughter's betrothal feast, and folk who had been present spoke well of it afterward. Laughter and merriment were always somewhat rare at Olav Audunsson's banquets, but all was done in a handsome and worthy manner. Signy and Una stayed on with 2 of their daughters and some serving maids, and now there was a busy time at Hestviken. Cecilia's rich dowry was to be inspected and to receive its last touches, and festival garments were to be prepared for those of his household whom Olav was to take with him on the bridal journey. One morning Signy came and said to Olav that now they must look through those things which the child was to inherit from her mother. Ingunn Steinfinnsons' bridal chest had stood during all these years in the closet where Olav slept. He had never answered when anyone had suggested removing it to the storehouse. So when he and old Tor carried it into the light, the women were afraid that the stuffs might have suffered damage. Olav had indeed kept it resting on the ends of 2 beams, but the air of the closet was always so raw. Olav saw that Cecilia was filled with expectation, though she appeared as calm as usual. His daughter had never set eyes on the goods she was to inherit from her mother. The chest had not been opened since the day Olav took his wife's grave clothes out of it. Olav gave the key to Signy, but the women could not cope with the lock. He had to do it himself. Then he stood by and looked at what they took out of the chest. The first thing that met his eyes was a folded cloth of reddish-brown wool. A glimpse of the wrong side was enough. They had used it in his childhood at Fretestein when they hung the walls of the hall. It was embroidered with the New Jerusalem and saints adoring the Lamb, according to the vision of St. John. Above and below the images there were borders of vines with beasts and hunters between. The women shook it out, and there fell from it a shower of dried flowers that had been put in to guard against moth. It was undamaged. "But beautiful you cannot call it," said Una. "It must be old as the hills." The saints were stumpy and broad, and all the men had beards. "This cannot be anything for Cecilia to take to Gunnarsby." "'Tis only laid over for a covering." Olav took the tapestry, rolled it up, and laid it on the bench behind him. Piece by piece the things were lifted into the daylight and shaken out, making the bystanders sneeze with the herbs and spices that filled the air. Cushions and tapestries, kirtles and mantles, chaperones of velvet and Flemish cloth, shifts with embroidered fronts of silk and linen, and many vests to which the skirts had not been attached. "She was deft with her hands, was Ingunn," said Una, handing one of these vests to Cecilia. "Have you ever seen such fine sewing?" Cecilia fingered the costly piece. It was of white silk, embroidered in black and gold threads at the wrists and neck. "No, I have never seen the like. Mother had great skill." Her father nodded. He had no wish to enter the conversation, but in fact it was not Ingunn who had sewed this shirt-body. He had bought it when he was in Stockholm with the Earl, from a man who said it came from Constantinople. Ingunn had never finished it for wearing. The women took out the carved coffer and spread the jewels over the table. Finger rings fastened together with a ribbon, brooches white and gilt, but blackened and tarnished for want of use, a decayed leather belt studded with plates of chased metal, a ring brooch of pure gold that he himself had given her. He had inherited it from his father. Around the ring was inscribed the angel's greeting, and Amor vincit omnia. Then Signy handed Olav a faded band of green velvet, thickly set with gilt roses. Ingunn's bridal garland, the symbol of inviolate maidenhood and gentle birth. "I wonder that you did not give this to Cecilia for her betrothal," said Signy. "The other garland that I gave her is better," replied Olaf, turning the matter aside. "This one weighs scarce the half of it." The women brought forward into the light a kirtle of green silk, woven with golden flowers and birds. Down to the waist it was fairly close-fitting, but wide below and exceedingly long. All the women broke into exclamations of delight at the beautiful stuff. It was a great pity that they must cut it shorter if Cecilia was to wear it at her bridal. Olaf remembered that Ingunn had had to lift it as she went round the table pouring wine. She had caught her foot in it as they ran hand in hand across the wet courtyard that summer night, and in the dark bower he had felt the soft silk about her slender body as part of the lawless sweetness of the adventure. His heart grew hot within him at the thought that that man should embrace his daughter in this very garb. "It would be a shame to cut it up and spoil such costly silk," he said. "Cecilia is not so old. She may grow taller yet. Her mother was a tall woman. Better to let this gown lie by a few years longer." Olaf had arranged with Ark Kolbeinsson that he was to visit Gunnarsby before the haymaking, in order to become acquainted with the home of the Ripungs before he brought his daughter thither. He went by way of Oslo, taking a number of jewels and vessels to the goldsmith. Cecilia would have to bring a share of such into the estate, but there was such good store at Hestviken that he needed only to have some of the old vessels remade. His daughter's marriage entailed expense enough, without his having to buy new silver for her dowry. The last day he was in the town, he went out into the fields and heard vespers in the Minorites' church. After the service he went to the gate and asked leave to speak with his son. Brother Eirik came down to the gate. Again Olaf gave a start on seeing the young monk. He was so unlike his old self. He had already acquired the monastic air, but in such a way that it suited him. At home Eirik had never seemed to know how to bear himself. Now he was too noisy, and now too abrupt. Now too courteous, and now too rude. But however he might be, there was too much effort in all he did. Now he seemed to have learnt to comport himself calmly, and he talked as though he had thought of what he was to say. He had little time, he said. It was this sickness that was rife. They had it here too. Father Einar said it came from the water. It turned rotten in the heat. So now he and Brother Arn were busy in the garden, but he would have to ask leave to bring his father thither so that they might talk as he worked. It was cool in the shade of the great birches, and the grass grew high and rank under the drip from the hollowed logs which carried a stream from Eikeberg down to the convent garden. Olaf sat taking his ease as he watched the two young friars in grey frocks watering rows of beans and beds of celery. On the flower beds beyond, a rose bloomed already here and there, and round about them yellow lilies swayed, and some blue flowers, the name of which Olaf did not know. Now and again, as Eirik went to the water butt, he said a few words to his father. Father Einar, the master of the novices, had already begun teaching him to read in a book and to write. It came easy to him. In one thing and another, Olaf recognized his son as of old. He had always had such a strong belief in himself, when he was to do anything, before he had really set about it. But Eirik had not been here more than 6 weeks, and already Olaf could see a great change in him. He sat there, letting his affection for Eirik thaw and warm his heart. After all, he had always been fond of this child in a way, and it was good to feel that this battered and crippled affection might now be suffered to grow healthy and strong. At Gunnarsby, Olaf was received with such marks of friendship and honour by the Kolbeinsons that he could not help liking the place. The manor was a fair one and a great, and lying as it did on the sunny slope above a little lake, with broad acres and meadows about it, and many new and well-built houses, it might well support 3 brothers in lordly fashion. Here the household was ordered more after the customs of the new nobles, as was to be expected, with young masters and a greater range of husbandry. Between the masters themselves and the labourers in farmyard and workyard, a crowd of serving men and maids passed to and fro. Some of these were poor kinsfolk of the Ripungs. Olaf had seen none of the women of Gunnarsby before now. Gunhild Ripa, the mother of the Kolbeinsons, was infirm and in her dotage, so Cecilia would have no mother-in-law above her. Ark's and Steinar's wives had just been brought to bed, both of them, when the betrothal feast was held at Hestviken. Olaf liked them least of all of the folk of Gunnarsby. Brynhild had a hard look, but Lucia was far too mild. She promised Olaf that Cecilia should have milk to wash in and wine to drink, as the saying goes. Olaf smiled to himself. Cecilia would be able to hold her own with them well enough. His child lacked neither wit nor will, and she bore herself in just as courtly a fashion as these 2 knights' daughters. Moreover, it was only natural that these brothers' wives should be glad to see the youngest of the family marry a franklin's daughter. Then he could leave Gunnarsby with wife and children when the time came. So Olaf was not ill-pleased with what he had seen when he rode from Gunnarsby. The summer heat held on day after day. Toward the middle of the afternoon the sky was often overcast. A dark blue wall, flecked with flame-coloured clouds, rose above the wooded ridges. Within the blue darkness gleamed distant lightnings, as when a candle is moved within a tent, and the thunder rolled faintly far up the country. Sometimes a shred of cloud brought a scud of rain over the dried-up fields, but the storm which was to clear the air was long in coming. And every evening it cleared up, and every morning dawned with a hazy blue sky which heralded a hot day. And broiling hot it was even in the middle of the morning, the day Olaf and Tor rode home through the woods that divide the districts of Ejavatten and the Oslo fjord. And toward the middle of the afternoon, as they were riding high up on a hillside, the thunderclouds again rolled up in the north and east, casting shadows over the sun-drenched woods and darkening the tarns scattered over the pale bogs which stretched everywhere on the lower land. The path led across some mountain pastures at the top of the ridge, and here they would unsaddle their horses and rest a few hours. Outside one of the saeters they found a young woman sitting and spinning, while she kept an eye on a cauldron which hung over a fire close by. When she saw that the newcomers were peaceful wayfarers, she was overjoyed at having guests. She pressed upon them both fresh milk and curds to take on their journey. After they had talked a while, it came out that old Tor had known some kinsfolk of her master. So they two sat and talked, while Olaf went down toward the brook which they heard murmuring in the wood nearby. He would look for a cool place where he could lie down and sleep. He had to go some way down. Up near the saeters the banks were trodden into mire around the watering places, and the ants swarmed on the moss where he had first flung himself down under the firs. But then he came to a little patch of dry, close-cropped grass, thyme and ground ivy, and there he stretched himself at the edge of the wood. He was not so sleepy. He lay looking up at the great dark silver-bordered clouds which drifted over the tree-tops, causing a succession of shadows and sharp yellow sunlight. The thunder muttered far away, and at the bottom of the slope the brook swirled and gurgled among great stones. On the other side of the stream the wood rose steeply to the rounded summit, but right opposite to him was a scree where masses of red-flowered willow herb grew amongst the stones. And all at once it flashed upon Olav that he had been here once before. He recognised the scree and the cascade of flowers and these black clouds silently rising, and the murmur of the brook and the distant thunder. All had been present before. Then the mirage vanished as suddenly as it had come. The place looked like any other watercourse in a wood. Olav lay down again, dozed with eyes half open to the sunshine, and breathed in the scent of herbs which floated about him and made him sleepy. Then all at once he was roused, broad awake, by a little whirring sound. Before he had time to grasp what it was, a shadow flitted past him as swiftly as the shadow of a bird in flight. He opened his eyes, looked about him, and was aware of Ingunn standing in the scree on the other side of the brook among the red flowers. Olav felt no surprise. As he rose on his knees, he saw in a flash every detail which he afterwards called to mind. A gust of warm wind passed through the wood at that moment. The tall red tufts of flowers waved, the trees leaned over with a yielding droop of their tops and a sighing in their branches, but her mantle of flowing light brown hair never stirred. She stood motionless, with her long pale hands crossed upon her bosom. Her white face was also perfectly motionless. She gazed at him with a strange, beseeching look in her great wide eyes. Although he was so far away, he could see that her skin was pale, and as it were bedewed, as it always was when she felt the heat. It did not occur to him to marvel that he saw her as she had been at the time when they were newly grown up. It did not occur to him that he was of any age either, as he rose and ran toward the vision. Time seemed to be no more. As he crossed the brook, she stretched out her hands toward him. He could not tell whether it was to receive him or forbid him to come nearer. But now he could read a great dread in her snow-white face. Then a stone slipped under his foot. Olav fell on his knee, and behind him there was a splash in the water. When he raised his head again, the vision was gone, but the tall swaying willow herbs scattered over the scree stirred as though someone had fled that way. For a moment he remained as he had fallen, on one knee, trying to collect himself. Then it came upon him, a wave of blood that seemed ready to burst his heart and his brain, and the scree was whirling upward, while dark patches fell one by one before his eyes, and he sank forward in a swoon. He was roused by spots of rain. The first he saw was that the stones were thickly splashed, but not all wet. He saw there was blood on the stones where he had lain, and he felt his face stiffened and wet with blood. He saw the grey trail of the shower as it swept up the course of the stream, while the wood was whitened by a gust which reversed the leaves. Olav stood up and felt as if all the marrow had been taken from his bones. He had a terrible pain in the head, not from the fall, but from within, and in the heart, as he realized that she had been here and was gone, and that the vision had been a revelation of other times than these, times which he believed to have gone by more than a generation ago. Body and soul were rent with a pain which was unlike any other he had known, and he thought, "This is death." Then the fit of pain passed over. He got back his breath and shook himself under the pouring rain. As he leapt back across the brook, he found he was trembling and weak all over. The rain streamed down, as Olav, a moment later, hurried across the pasture. Tor and the woman were peeping out through the door of the shed. "What have you done to yourself, Olav?" asked the housecarl in surprise. Olav had forgotten the blood on his face. He answered that he had run his forehead against the trunk of a fir. He flung himself down at the couch at the far end of the satyr hut and lay prone with his hands before his face, trying to get to the bottom of this. The other two stood at the door, looking out at the rain. The sun was shining again, and the woodland gleamed green and blue and fine after its bath, as Olaf and Tor rode on in the afternoon. Olaf was deep in thought, but at the bottom of his soul, deeper than doubt and disquietude, lay joy. He had seen that death had not yet parted him from her, and that his own youth was living somewhere in space and time, in spite of all he had done to kill it. They did not reach Hestviken until night. Olaf helped Tor with the horses. They put them in the stable in case there might be another thunderstorm during the night. Then a strange thing happened, as Olaf reached over to pat the colt that stood in the stall next to his saddle horse. The animal plunged, making a great clatter, shied and backed away. When Olaf, in surprise, was going up to it, the colt went quite wild. "It seems the horse is afraid of you," said Tor. Olaf had to leave its stall. He said nothing. He fell asleep as soon as he lay down. In the morning his memory of the vision was half faded, or as though it had happened long ago. But as he was about to dress, he went to the door of the closet to look over his shirt. He was afraid he had got ticks from the satyr. Then he saw with the corner of his eye that he was bleeding behind the shoulder. There was the mark of a bite. As he looked at it, fresh blood oozed out of the little tooth marks. Once more the choking, bursting pain returned in his head and heart, and Olaf had to clutch the doorpost until he had mastered the thought that this inconceivable thing was true, however it might have come about. He had had a little scar there. Ingunn had bitten him once in wantonness. One night he had been with her in her bower at Fretterstein. It was an age since he had thought of it, for the mark had almost faded out with the years, and it was so far back on his shoulder that he could not see it without turning his head. But now the blood trickled red and fresh from the little pits left by her teeth.